Welcome, everyone. My name is Ken Davis. I'm the Dean of the Law School, and it is my honor to welcome all of you to this year's edition of the Robert Kastenmeier Lecture Series. So we've got an absolutely wonderful program for you today. So to get it started, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Peter Carstensen.
Thank you, Ken. And I'd like to take this opportunity. Ken is stepping down after 14 years, or will step down after 14 years as dean. He's been a truly dedicated dean to this for this law school, has done an outstanding job of promoting and supporting the law school, faculty generally, and one of the many areas where he has made a real contribution has been in his support for the Kastenmeier Lecture, and I really appreciate all your fine work, Ken. And now I have another great privilege, which is to introduce my very good friend, Bob Kastenmeier. I can say that as a high school student, I worked in Bob's successful 1958 campaign distributing bumper strippers all over Dane County. Bob got elected to Congress in 1958. He is a 1952 graduate of this law school, served for 32 years in Congress. And as I watch the kind of behavior in Congress today, the inability to work across the aisle, the unwillingness to address major issues, I am increasingly wishing that we could return to days which I would not have thought of with quite so much nostalgia in terms of many of the issues of the time, but it was a time when we had more responsible members of the legislature on both sides of the aisle, and Bob was one of the true leaders in that somewhat better legislative day. I'm not saying the rest of the issues that we faced were necessarily better. So with that, Bob, please.
Thank you, Peter. It's a delight for us, for Dorothy and myself, to be back here for another lecture. I think we've had, this is our 17th lecture, and we've had in 18 years that the program was started. And I too would like to second our appreciation to the Dean for his support of the program and for his kindness over the years. I'm sure he will be sorely missed. I'd like to also thank those who are responsible for this particular program. The planning committee consists of our chairman, Peter Carstensen, and Mike Remington, and Bill Kaplan. These are the people who worked this particular time on this program and are responsible for it. And I'm certainly indebted to them for it. Also in the law school, I'd like to mention Kimberly Frank, who is particularly helpful, a real important cog in making this as obvious success it is, and some of the others, Teresa Evans and the rest of the staff. As much as I admire our guest speaker and his writing over the years, it's not my privilege to introduce him. That honor I've awarded to Bill Kaplan. I want to talk just a little bit about Bill. Bill was a student here from 1965 to 1971 during the tumultuous years of Vietnam. And those 6 years, I don't suppose Bill spent every moment in class or studying, but nonetheless, those were the years that formed part of whom he is. Bill also, as a matter of fact, went to the graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, in social work. He early organized the first hospital local in the state of Wisconsin. He has served as a counsel on many things. He as a congressional assistant, worked in campaigns. So he is the quintessential activist. And perhaps some of you remember him mostly because from 1995, I think, to 2009, he was a guest columnist for the State Journal. So his interest in politics and in the issues we're discussing, even this very afternoon, has been a long-term one. So it is with regular pride that I present my friend, Bill Kaplan.
I'm deeply honored to be part of this program with Representative Kastenmeier and New York Times columnist Bob Herbert. These are two extraordinary, principled individuals. My first guest column in 1995 for the Wisconsin State Journal was a critical look at the late former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and his memoirs, In Retrospect, The Tragedy and Lessons of Vietnam. I wrote that Representative Kastenmeier's 1965 grassroots hearings on the Vietnam War, quote, showed McNamara a different road to go down. Kastenmeier's prescient opposition to the Vietnam War was a profile in courage and set a political standard for decency, honor, and morality that very few political leaders anywhere have since matched. Now, once again, our nation is waging war in a faraway country, Afghanistan. The Afghan War has become America's longest war since the Vietnam War. So it is fitting that the subject of this year's Kastenmeier Lecture is Afghanistan, what are we fighting for? Our speaker is distinguished New York Times columnist Bob Herbert. He is someone who speaks truth to power. Herbert's eloquent writing always asks the tough questions and shines a bright light on abuses of power and deception. Herbert served in the U.S. Army in South Korea in the 1960s. He knows well the cost and the horror of war. Having lost two close friends to the Vietnam War, Bob Herbert never forgot the lessons of that misbegotten folly, that going to war is a serious business and giving a president a blank check can lead to disaster. Bob Herbert was not born into wealth and privilege. His family owned an upholstery shop in New Jersey. His columns reflect the concerns of what our own Wisconsin Representative David Obey calls regular folks. Herbert writes powerfully about the calculated attacks on the powerless and the poor, while the well-heeled increase their influence and wealth. His columns are town hall meetings, always civil and calling for an involved and vibrant democratic process. Bob Herbert joined the New York Times as an op-ed columnist in 1993. His twice-a-week column comments on politics, urban affairs, and social trends. Prior to being with the Times, he was a national correspondent for NBC from 1991 to 1993. He reported regularly on the Today Show and NBC Nightly News. He has worked as a reporter and an editor at the Daily News from 76 to 85, when he became a columnist and a member of the Daily News editorial board. In 1990, he was a founding panelist of the Sunday Edition, a weekly discussion on WCBS TV in New York, and the host of Hotline, a weekly issues program on New York PBS. He began his career in journalism with the Star-Ledger in Newark, New Jersey in '79, and he became its night editor in '73. He has won more awards than I can list. Let me just simply say there are a lot of them. He was born in Brooklyn. He received his BS degree in journalism from the State University of New York. He has taught journalism at Brooklyn College and Columbia University, and he lives in Manhattan on the Upper West Side. And it is with honor, excitement, and distinct pleasure that I turn the podium over to Bob Herbert.
Thank you so much, man. That's wonderful. Thank you. I think I don't need it. I'm Mike. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I am always paranoid that nobody is going to show up, so first hurdle has been cleared. I'm going to get a glass of water and we'll get going. Hide it down here. When I went to the Daily News in 1976, and it was like something out of the front page, guys would have a little something in the drawer of their desk. It was not water. There are an awful lot of people to thank, and I'm not going to do it. I'm going to cut the thanks short because so many people have been responsible and helpful in getting me here and giving me the opportunity to give this very prestigious lecture. And I just want to assure you that this is really such a great honor. But I would specifically like to thank Bob and Dorothy Kastenmeier, who have been the souls of graciousness since I came here yesterday, and they invited me to dinner last night with colleagues and friends, and that was wonderful. And I want to thank Bill Kaplan, who has been such a significant factor in arranging everything and has made my life so much easier. Because it's tough. I'm writing a book, and I'm doing the columns, and getting me out here and keeping everything under control has really been wonderful, and I thank Bill for that. And then all the others who had a role in selecting me and giving me the honor to present this lecture, I offer my thanks. Dan Bershinsky knew at a very early age that he wanted to be in the Army. Now, this was not at first, though, because when he was 4, as his mother told me just last week, Dan's expressed goal was to be a garbage man, but that soon gave way to a passionate and almost lifelong desire to be a soldier. Dan and his older brother Rob grew up in an idyllic suburb of Atlanta, Peachtree City, which is the home base for quite a few Delta airline pilots and retired military personnel. Rob went into the Air Force and served in Iraq as an intelligence officer attached to a special operations unit. Dan, who is not a very big guy and has always seemed to look very young for his age, but who also I've learned is deceptively tough and determined, Dan went to West Point. The story I'm going to tell is about his experience as an infantry platoon officer in Afghanistan last year. The platoon's mission was to move into an area along the Arghandab River in southern Afghanistan and gather intelligence about the Taliban. This new lieutenant, Dan Bershinsky, all of 24 years old, led patrols nearly every day through small towns along the river. And nearly every patrol had some sort of contact with the enemy. Vehicles were regularly getting hit with roadside bombs, improvised explosive devices. And as Dan put it, none of the towns was all that friendly. What the soldiers had heard was that the Taliban would hide out in the daytime in orchards outside the towns, and under the canopy of the trees, they could not easily be spotted by the helicopters flying overhead. They would go into the towns during the dark of night. Dan's company commander wanted him to take his platoon into the orchards to see exactly what was going on. As Dan told me, we had maps that indicated there was a system of trails in there, but no one had actually seen them. So about 3 in the afternoon on August 18, 2009, Dan led his platoon on what was supposed to be a reconnaissance mission into the orchards. His men were supposed to enter the orchards from the north and move south, and another platoon would enter from the south, and the 2 units would end up roughly in the same area. But things did not go well. As planned, the soldiers left their vehicles and began walking through town to get to the orchards. The other platoon got about a 30-minute head start, and then Dan's platoon moved out. The other platoon was about 500 meters down a trail into the orchards when there was an explosion. Dan and his men heard the blast and saw smoke rising on the horizon. They were given emergency orders to link up as quickly as possible with the other platoon, which had been hit with an IED and was coming under small arms fire. Dan's platoon moved along a trail that seemed to be the most direct route toward the others. They came upon a tiny footbridge, just 2 meters or so long, that went over an irrigation canal. Dan ordered one team across this little bridge, and then he followed with another team. Walking behind Dan was a 20-year-old PFC named Jonathan Yanni. When Yanni stepped onto the bridge, he triggered an IED. He was the only one on the bridge when the bomb went off. The blast sent everyone who was nearby, including Dan, sprawling. Dan immediately began crawling around in the dust and the debris, calling out names and checking to see who might be injured. A fellow named Garcia was rattled and couldn't seem to hear anything, but otherwise he was okay. But when Yanni's name was called, there was no response. They couldn't find him. His antenna, part of the equipment he was carrying, was spotted up in a tree. They called for assistance, established a perimeter, and they kept looking. They climbed onto nearby roofs. They checked flood walls that guarded the orchards. They did everything they could think of. They could not find Yanni. The company commander eventually radioed orders for Dan's platoon to leave the area and meet up with the rest of the company at a site that was not far from where the other platoon had been attacked. Dan gathered his men and they moved out, shaken that they had been unable to find their comrade. It turned out that the other platoon had a soldier missing as well, a 21-year-old specialist named Troy Tom. Thus, 2 young men were gone and presumed dead, but no one knew where they were. Night was coming on. The various units were assigned to quarters in buildings that had been taken over and turned into military compounds. At some point during the night, the company commander summoned the platoon leaders to a meeting. So Dan, accompanied by another soldier, left his quarters and went off as ordered to the meeting, which was in another compound. Returning a couple of hours later, he walked along the same trail toward his compound that everyone else had been walking along for hours. I'm walking in front, he told me. My soldiers behind me, and I'm about 3 steps, literally, from entering my compound. I give out the challenge to let them know I'm coming in the gate, and then there's just a big explosion, a big boom, and a tremendous sense of pressure. And suddenly I was lying on the ground as if I was on a slant with my head lower than my feet. Guys who ran immediately to Dan's aid would later tell him that he had cried out, guys, I need help. I need a medic. I stepped on something. I have no legs. both of his legs were gone. In an instant, just gone. Just like Yanni was gone in an instant. This is what war is, suffering and bloodshed and terror and death. It's a horror that's almost unimaginable to those who have not experienced it. If we're going to subject our young people to that kind of hell, there ought to be a damn good reason for it. That reason ought to be clearly and easily articulated. And the rest of the nation, and by that I mean everybody, ought to be sharing in some significant way in the sacrifices that we are asking our young servicemen and women to make. I wrote a column back in April about one of the most important speeches that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. ever made. It was a speech delivered in New York on April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church, and it was about the war in Vietnam. Dr. King began the speech by saying, "I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice." He told the people who had crowded into the church that silence in the face of the horror that was taking place in Vietnam amounted to a betrayal. He spoke of the carnage in the war zone and the toll that the war was taking here in the United States. It was time, he said, to bring it all to an end. But he didn't minimize how difficult a task that would be. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, said Dr. King, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in a time of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformist thought within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world. Moreover, he continued, when the issues at hand seem as perplexing as they often do in the case of this dreadful conflict, we are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty, but we must move on. I was drafted into the Army in 1965 during the big troop buildup for Vietnam. I was lucky. I just happened to get sent to Korea instead of Vietnam. But many of my friends went off to that awful war, and some were wounded and some were killed. So I knew at the time what Dr. King was talking about. The better part of half a century has passed since then. It is just too weird to hear the concerns and the dismay expressed by Dr. King in that speech so long ago, and to realize how much they apply to the tragic situation we find ourselves in right now in 2010. We didn't listen to Dr. King then, and we're still not listening. I met Dan Brzezinski several months ago at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington. He told me how much he had loved being in the Army and how tough it was to look ahead to a life with no legs. He was not down, but neither did he sugarcoat his situation. One leg had been lost all the way to the hip, and the odds were that he would not even be able to walk with prosthetic limbs. The damage was just too severe. But Dan soon made it clear to me that he was having none of that. "Oh, I'm going to walk," he told me. On the day that I met him, he was learning to take his first excruciatingly painful steps. He was in a harness. He had a makeshift prosthetics, and he was trying to take his first steps, and he was in a harness that kept him from falling, and a therapist was right there with him, right beside him. He was on a ramp outside the hospital, and the afternoon was bitterly cold. I stood there shivering and taking notes. It did not look like he was making a lot of progress. Later in the day, he told me, things are physically difficult, but I'll say this, the emotional or mental factor is much bigger than the physical factor. The physical therapy is not that big a deal, he told me. I played sports my whole life, so exercising or lifting weights, that's not hard. I used to do that for fun. It's just that I had legs when I was doing them. What becomes hard is realizing that, holy crap, I used to run marathons, and now I can't even walk a mile. I mean, I can't walk 500 meters right now. But I'll walk, he said. The way I feel now, I'll do pretty much anything, to fix myself, to get it done. What I wonder is whether we will do whatever we need to do as a society to fix ourselves. One of the first and most difficult things we need to do is free ourselves from these perpetual and profoundly debilitating wars. More than 4,500 Americans have died in Iraq, and well over 1,000 in Afghanistan. Many thousands more have been wounded. Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, and his colleague Linda Bilmes have told us that the two wars will eventually cost the United States more than $3 trillion. We don't have enough troops to fight the wars, so we keep sending the same people into the combat zones for tour after tour after tour, which is psychologically destructive and unconscionably cruel. Lance Vogler, a 29-year-old Sergeant First Class, was recently killed on his 12th combat tour, 4 of them in Iraq, 8 in Afghanistan. He was married and the father of 2 children, and his wife was expecting their 3rd child. 12 tours may be unusual, but multiple tours are the norm. The price of this nonstop warfare would be shocking if only we'd pay attention. Time magazine tells us that stressed out, depressed, and despondent soldiers are seeking help for their mental difficulties at a rate that is overwhelming the capacity of available professionals. The magazine called the mental health issue the U.S. Army's third front, describing it as a battle to save soldiers' sanity when they come back, one that will cost billions long after combat ends in Baghdad and Kabul. The suicide rate among active service members is appallingly high and getting worse. As my own newspaper, the New York Times, reported, from the beginning of this year through the month of August, at least 125 soldiers had killed themselves. That's a pace exceeding last year's record number of 162 Army suicides. These are young kids that we're talking about. Chris Philbrick, the deputy director of a special military task force created to reduce the number of suicides, said, "If the test for success is our numbers and our rate, then clearly we have not been successful." We're loading our troops up with antidepressants, sleeping pills, anti-anxiety drugs, and God knows what other kinds of medication to keep them going in these wars without end. The terrible toll on the troops and their families manifests itself in all kinds of ways. And I'm going to read you an email. Excuse me. This is an email that I wrote about in a column. Dear Daddy, happy Father's Day. I love you so much, and you can't imagine how often I think of you. I hope you have lots of fun today and that the weather is lovely. We had a briefing telling us to prepare ourselves as best as possible for what lies ahead. Things like children running in front of vehicles to try and get them to stop. We have to prepare ourselves to hit people because stopping is not an option. I guess every convoy that's gone up north so far has taken fire or been ambushed. The question of whether we will or not is not really a question, more like a guess as to when. These things, as you can imagine, are a lot to take in. I'm doing my best. I've been a little depressed lately, but I'm trying to keep my chin up. I really miss home. Tomorrow will be exactly 3 months since I got deployed. Wow, time does not fly. Geez, this letter was not supposed to be down. Sorry. Back to the point. Happy Father's Day. I love and miss you so much. Love, Shelley. Specialist Michelle Whitmer of New Berlin, Wisconsin, survived for nearly 10 slowly moving months in Iraq after she sent that letter to her dad. She was just 20 years old when she was killed by enemy fire in Baghdad on April 9th, 2004. Her father read that email on camera for a documentary called Last Letters Home, which was produced by the New York Times and HBO television. Michelle's letter was just one of many that, if you heard them, would break your hearts. I remember talking with a soldier whose unit was ambushed in Iraq. He had fired back in a fierce close encounter and believed that he had shot 3 of the attackers. When I met him, he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. During the course of the interview, he let me know that he was deeply religious and said the real issue that was haunting him was his fear that because he had killed someone, he would never be allowed to go into heaven. He couldn't seem to get past that. The problem, folks, is not with the troops. It's with us. We're fighting these terrible wars with no real sense of what the hell we are doing. What are we trying to achieve? With no real sense of what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve, and why we haven't succeeded after all these years. The war in Afghanistan began October 7, 2001, which means it's now in its 10th year. And yet, after all this time, even our policymakers are at a loss to explain what we're fighting for. It seemed clear enough at first we were going after al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. Nearly all Americans and most of the world supported that action. But now, after all these long years, and all the lives lost, and all the blood and the sadness and the tears, it's not at all clear what we're doing. Are we still trying to get al-Qaeda and bin Laden? Well, they're in Pakistan. Are we nation building in Afghanistan? Well, to what end? And has that mission and its cost been spelled out to the American people? Are we trying to destroy the Taliban? According to Bob Woodward's book, Obama's Wars, Vice President Joe Biden returned from a tour of Afghanistan and told President Obama, if you ask 10 of our people what we're trying to accomplish here, you get 10 different answers. It's time to bring this awful, tragic madness to an end. We have occupied Afghanistan for nearly a decade and have not captured bin Laden or crushed al-Qaeda. We have not brought the Taliban to its knees. We have expanded the war into Pakistan and generated ever more intense hatred for all things American, but we are not on the verge of any sort of victory. A preliminary effort is underway to begin peace negotiations with the Taliban, but that is in the very early stages, so we can only hope that it bears fruit. As for Iraq, we don't have time now to catalog our crazy behavior there. But we've recently learned that many of the Sunni insurgents that were members of the awakening councils that we thought had come over to our side have quit our ranks and rejoined the insurgency. They've taken knowledge of our military procedures and operations with them. And worse, there are perhaps thousands of these fighters who still claim to be allied with us, but are in fact covertly aiding the enemy. So that's what's going on in Iraq after all these years. When is enough enough? How do we find the courage as a society to finally pull the plug on these world-class, monumentally tragic fiascos? While we continue to fight these futile, endless foreign wars, what is happening to us here at home? We are mired in the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Nearly 15 million Americans are unemployed, and millions more are working part-time or have given up looking for work altogether. We are seeing record rates of home foreclosures. It is expected that the number of foreclosures for 2010 will surpass 1 million. Incomes are falling, poverty rates are rising, and our political leaders seem unable to cope with the enormity of the tasks confronting them. State and local governments are struggling with nightmarish budget scenarios, cutting essential services, firing teachers, public safety officers, and other public employees by the thousands. When I walk the streets of Camden, New Jersey, or the south side of Chicago, or South LA, when I visit the local neighborhoods of Rust Belt cities, or travel to the rural areas of our country, I see the young people who have not gotten a decent education and can't find decent work, and who fall prey too often to crime or drugs or gangs or other forms of destructive behavior. These are young people that we are leaving behind by the hundreds of thousands, and yet we have trillions of dollars to spend on these mad wars. Nothing good can come of this. As Dr. King said in that speech at Riverside Church, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. One of the main reasons we continue with these dreadful wars is that so few Americans have any real stake in them. The public tuned out long ago. For the vast majority of Americans in this era of the volunteer military, wars are something to be fought by other people's children. There is nothing like the shared sacrifice and shared sense of responsibility that took place during World War II. If we had a draft, people would pay attention, but we don't have a draft. There is no real reason for most Americans to give the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq a second thought. There are no shortages of goods as a result of the wars, no rationing. We haven't even raised taxes to pay for the wars. If you placed the globe in front of most Americans, they would have a heck of a time trying to find Afghanistan or Iraq. And it's that atmosphere of monstrous, monumental indifference that enables our leaders to launch these wars willy-nilly and carry them on haphazardly and wastefully without regard to the terrible toll they are taking on our overstretched servicemen and women, and without regard to the terrible grief and hardships endured by family members and friends. I remember talking with Kevin and Joyce Lucy of Belchertown, Massachusetts a few years ago. Their son's name was Jeffrey, and he had signed up for the Marine Reserves when he was 18. His unit was activated, and he was part of the first wave of troops into Iraq. One of Jeff's diary entries noted the explosion of a Scud missile near his unit. The noise, he wrote, was just sort of blowing out your eardrums. Everyone's heart truly skipped a beat. Nerves are on edge. When he came home, Jeff Lucy was a mess. In a moment of deep despair on the Christmas Eve after his return from Iraq, he hurled his dog tags at his sister Deborah and cried out, "Don't you know that your brother's a murderer?" He had nightmares. He drank furiously. He withdrew from his friends. He wrecked his parents' car. He began to hallucinate. One evening, Jeff's dad came home and called out to his son. He noticed that the door leading to the basement was open and the basement light was on. He did not notice the 2 notes that Jeffrey had left for his parents on the first floor. One note said, "It is 4:35 p.m. and I am near completing my death." The other said, "Dad, please don't look. Mom, just call the police. Love, Jeff." The first thing Mr. Lucy saw as he walked down to the basement was that Jeff had set up an elaborate arrangement of photos. There was a picture of his platoon and photos of his sisters, Deborah and Kelly, his parents, the family dog, and himself. Then Mr. Lucy said, "I could see through the corner of my eye Jeff. And he was, I thought, standing there. Then I noticed the hose around his neck." Mrs. Lucy told me that after Jeff's death, she and her husband continued to see him everywhere. "Every little dark-haired boy you see," she said, "looks like Jeff. If we see a parent reprimanding a child, it's like you want to go up and say, 'Oh, don't do that,' because you don't know how long you're going to have him." Wars do terrible things to real people. When we're not personally involved, when we keep the terrible reality of war at a distance, we make it easy for those terrible things to continue year after horrible, agonizing year. We, as a people, should be better than that. We should try to understand the overwhelming suffering and grief that our policies are inflicting on so many, not just our troops and their loved ones, but also the innocent lives of others that are destroyed because they happen to get caught up in the hideous violence of these wars. We should take our cue from Dwight Eisenhower, who said, "I hate war as only a soldier who has lived it can, only as one who has seen its brutality, its futility, its stupidity." And it was Eisenhower who said, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed." This world in arms, said Eisenhower, is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. I am not a pacifist. I served 2 years in the Army, and I believe there are times when a nation must fight to defend itself. But if a nation must go to war, then everyone should share in the sacrifice. It is obscene that Americans are fighting and dying in uniform overseas, while so many of their fellow citizens here at home are completely unaware of what is happening, or are aware, but nevertheless are unconcerned. Taxes should be raised to cover the costs of the wars we fight. Overwhelming force should be used to defeat the enemy, and the war should be brought to a conclusion as quickly as possible. If we do have to fight, it should be clear to everyone that all other options were exhausted and that war was without any doubt the last resort. And at all costs, we should get over the abominable notion that we somehow have a right to wage wars that will be fought by other people's children. I went to Peachtree City, Georgia last week to visit with Dan Bershinsky's parents, Bob and Susan Bershinsky. Dan, who has since been promoted to captain, is still in the hospital at Walter Reed. Bob and Susan are grateful, of course, that their son is alive, and they are upbeat about his prospects. They told me that he will get a pair of newly developed computerized prosthetic legs that work in tandem and will hasten his ability to walk again. These new devices, said Mr. Bershinsky, is like going from a horse and buggy to a rocket ship. I am holding on to Dan Bershinsky's story as a reason to be optimistic. With so much doom and gloom all about, his determination in the face of such a long, slow, and painful period of recovery is evidence to me of our capacity as individuals and as a society to overcome what might at first appear to be overwhelming obstacles. Dan told me I was always a pretty capable guy. I jumped out of airplanes. I went to Ranger School. I was trained to kill the enemy and to lead others in combat. So now to realize that I can't even go to the bathroom in the middle of the night without a wheelchair is quite humbling. But it is in the context of that very acceptance of the reality of his situation that Dan finds the strength and resources and the necessary strategies to overcome. This is what he told me. I would say that I became somewhat depressed at first. I think it would be impossible not to get depressed. But I have a pretty good attitude. I'm real easygoing. I have an amazing family. I have a good sense of purpose. I'm not at all angry about what happened. No matter how I may have felt about the war, I think my purpose there was to take care of my guys, so that was all the motivation I needed. Therapy has been going well, and I think I am going to be able to walk, and that later on in life, I will be able to wake up in the morning, put my legs on, go to work, and then come home and relax, which is my goal. I actually see that happening now. So yeah, I was probably a little bit depressed, but I got past that. You know, here at Walter Reed, you're surrounded by other soldiers, others who have it a lot worse than me, you know? One more thing about Dan. His dad sent me a video of Dan at a celebration in his honor in Peachtree City. Dan was seated on a podium as a warm and detailed introduction was being made. I was surprised to see that he apparently had been fitted with prosthetic legs. And then, amid prolonged applause from the audience, he stood up, reached for a pair of canes, and walked ever so slowly to the podium, where he gave a hell of a speech. We can get our act together as a nation. We can extricate ourselves from Afghanistan and Iraq and redirect our policies in ways that prevent us from plunging into the nonstop horror of unnecessary war. We can reimagine America and use our creative energies to build a society that is more cooperative and constructive, more thoughtful and strategic than it is now. A society that is more willing to invest in jobs and schools and infrastructure here at home than in our already awesome capacity to wreak havoc and destruction abroad. We can do that. We can imagine a new and better, a finer America, and then set ourselves the tough but joyful collective task of achieving it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was just incredible. And well, I don't know if this is incredible too, but this is a symbol of our law school. I know for many of you, it's probably your first time here. This is the gargoyle. It survived the destruction of our old building. And it's actually, you can see the real thing. It's out by the reception wearing, the last time I saw it, a Wisconsin Indian Law t-shirt promoting the sale of shirts by our Indigenous Law Society. So you can help that student organization as well. But thank you very much for those wonderful remarks.
All right. Are we going to take any questions?
And we'll do you the favor of shipping that to wherever you want so you don't have to deal with the TSA and explain to them what it is. That it's not an IED.
Scare the people on Delta.
Right. Mr. Herbert has kindly agreed to take some questions, but you're going to have to be a little bit patient. We'll have people pass the microphones, but because we have 2 overflow rooms, the people in those rooms won't have any idea what your question is until you wait for a mic. So okay. I'll pass this one to this gentleman here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming to Madison and your talk. I agree that perhaps we don't have as many wars if we have a draft and the Congress people have to send their children, but there really is no will for that. I mean, how would you characterize the ability to even get anything like that?
That's how I would characterize it, which is why I only mentioned it in passing. I said if we had a draft, this sort of thing would not be going on, but we don't have a draft, and there is no will for it. I wish there was, if I could wave a magic wand. I know there's an awful lot of people, people who usually agree with me who disagree on this one, but if I could wave a magic wand right now, we'd have a draft. And the draft that I would have would not necessarily be, or would not be exclusively a military draft. I would have a year and a half or 2 years of public service that would be required. And unless you were disabled in some way or another, you would have to do this service. And it could be any kind of thing. I mean, I wouldn't care if you were tutoring students or if you were working in a hospital or whatever anyone might think of, but you would do public service. You could be in the military if you wanted to, if you chose to. But if we went to war, everybody would be subject to serving in the military or an equivalent of the military in that war. I feel very strongly about that.
Do you have any practical suggestions to activists like, say, Bill Kaplan or myself
Yeah.
Of
Well,
actions
you guys
we could
don't need
take.
it.
No. It's not it's what practical things do we do? I mean, street demonstrations.
Here's how I would answer that. I'm serious when I say you guys don't need it. What I would say is act. I wish everybody would act. I wish people would stand up, call your elected representatives, hold meetings, discuss whatever issues you want to talk about. It's not just the war, it's the state of the economy here at home and all other kinds of problems facing this society. What I think is the society itself is much too passive. So I would like people to stand up, speak out, demonstrate if you're so inclined, but raise your voices. I mean, when King gave that speech in 1967, he said that his conscience drove him to speak up, that he could not remain silent. That's what I want to hear from the American people. I want to hear people not remain silent. I want to hear their voices. And if I can hear their voices loud and clear, it means our elected leaders can hear their voices loud and clear. And that's what I think is important. And that's how you really get change.
It's my opinion that we've already lost the war, because it's my opinion that Al-Qaeda just wants to bankrupt us. And if they can drag things out for however long they can, then they've won.
Well, what I think on that issue is that I mean, September 11th was such a shock to everyone, and for us in Manhattan, it was, like warfare in your backyard. And my wife, who runs a foundation, works on Wall Street, so she's like walking distance from that chaos. So I wouldn't minimize the threat of terror in any way, shape, or form. But I just think that the ways in which we have reacted to that attack have been so, in so many instances, self-defeating, and in some cases profoundly self-defeating, that we really need to get a grip and say, well, wait a minute, let's see how we can address this terrible and always potentially tragic threat of terror on the one hand, but two, let's see how we can maintain the kind of society that we want to maintain, that we want to have here in America, and not undermine ourselves. There are enough enemies out there. We don't need to be enemies to ourselves. So my response is that we need to stop the self-destructive behavior, and I think that certainly going into Iraq was an act of profound self-destruction, and then that's gone on for so long. And then the way I supported the invasion of Afghanistan, but the way we've conducted that war, is just to me madness. So I would say stop the self-destructive, stop the self-destruction.
Okay, I have the microphone here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about families like the Brzezinskis and other military families. When you meet them, I'm under the impression that those people would be very upset if we pulled out of Afghanistan. And how do you talk to them, or what do they tell you? I mean, I just, from what I read, I am under that impression that they don't want us to pull out too soon, and they feel like we let their children down.
I think we have to be careful about the sweeping judgments. The Brzezinskis themselves would surprise you. It's a family, and especially given where they live, it would surprise you because they're in an area where there is very strong support for the military and for these wars. And certainly I have met a lot of families that are not so much that they support the wars or would be upset if we pulled out, but have what I think is the very human emotion that they do not want their youngsters to have died or been wounded in vain. They don't want their service to have been meaningless. So I agree with you that we need to be careful and not behave in such a way that you convey that impression. But there are an awful lot of families, and the Brzezinskis are among them, who were never crazy about our posture, especially in Iraq in the first place, and in the way we've conducted the war in Afghanistan. The Lucys, very similar, the parents of the young man who committed suicide, they were very upset about our foreign policies and the wars and that sort of thing. So there is a range of feeling out there. But I also would say, even for those families, and obviously there are many because we're talking about military families, even those families who are gung-ho for the wars, for both of those wars, and who don't think that now, that we should be pulling out now, even though those families exist, I think that it is important for us to be respectful of them and to take steps to make sure that we are not offensive or hurt them, but we have an obligation, if we feel strongly about these wars, to follow the path that our instincts are telling us, that our instincts and our awareness are telling us. And if these wars are harmful to the nation as a whole, we cannot let that thought stop us from proceeding along a route that, in my view, would be much more constructive. I don't get usually I get the point, power, but it's been taken away from me.
Hello.
Oh, there's a microphone.
Here I am.
Yeah.
I just want to know how you feel about the failure of the Obama administration to not prosecute the war criminals in the Bush administration, the people that gave us an illegal invasion of a sovereign country.
Well, I don't want to talk about the prosecution of the people in the Bush administration because that's a whole can of worms that I have feelings, I have thoughts about that, but you know, we get tied up in that and never get anywhere. But I will say this, that I have been deeply disappointed in the Obama administration's track record on civil liberties issues and other related issues with regard to the detention, the prosecution of terror suspects, the secret prisons that we still maintain around the world, rendition, which I have written a great deal about some of the scandalous behavior that continues inside the CIA and that sort of thing. So my response is that I'm very, very disappointed with the administration on those issues. I think the track record on civil liberties issues and related issues has been terrible. Who's got a mic?
I'm trying to think of the forces that keep us going to war because everyone in this room would agree that it's bad. So I'd ask you if you would comment on the role of the armaments industry in keeping things going.
Two answers. The first thing is that as you were asking the question, I didn't know you were going to say that, and I was going to say the armaments industry is. So obviously I agree with you on that. But I think that there are just so many factors. It's just politically and in other ways, it's just so much easier to go to war, to go off to war, to wage war than it is to be serious and thoughtful and look for alternatives, and even to conduct the wars in what I would think of as a sane way once you've pulled the initial trigger. I think I am actually going to be looking into the arms industry and hopefully writing about that, and hopefully after I begin looking into it, I'll be more knowledgeable about it than I am now. But I think that that's obviously a major factor. But I also think that we can't dismiss this idea the Republicans got us into Iraq, and everybody knows the whole story and that sort of thing. We know the history of Afghanistan. But we also need to keep in mind and see if we can figure out a way to change this. The reaction of Democrats and Democratic presidents with their paranoia about being perceived by the Republicans and the right wing and maybe the population as a whole or whatever as being soft on national security, not being tough enough, not being quick enough to wage wars, not, you know, I just think that it's awful. I know that candidate Obama was always careful to hedge his comments about, you know, his opposition to Iraq, but I'm not opposed to all wars, and Afghanistan has been the neglected war, and he's either said or gave the impression that he would escalate in Afghanistan. But frankly, that was not what voters were hearing, however he parsed those words. Voters on the campaign trail in 2007 and 2008 were not hearing that a major element of an Obama administration would be a major escalation of the war in Afghanistan. Maybe that's what they should have heard, but that's not what they heard, and frankly, that's not what I heard. And so I think people have a right to be upset if they are. It remains to be seen how upset people are. People aren't even talking much about Afghanistan. But I think people who supported Obama have a right to be upset about his administration's policy on Afghanistan.
Hello. Hello, and thank you for being here.
Hi.
This is a two-part.
You have a youngster in Afghanistan.
And this is a little hard to take. And I'll tell you why.
Tell me.
Is there nothing good that has come of our presence in Iraq and Afghanistan, in particular Afghanistan? Just a minute. Mm-hmm. My son says that perhaps there hasn't been another 9/11 on our grounds because of our efforts there. And the other thing is, here we are 2 weeks before an election that it looks like we have this gap in interest to vote, and we may turn our Congress into more Republican folks who, you know, does our country lack the maturity and the intellectualism to get those premise that you talked about? I'm very concerned about
Let me respond.
Both ends.
Sure. I would never say and don't believe that nothing positive has come out of these two wars. What I wrote long before September 11th about the way the Taliban treated women in Afghanistan, for example. That was a big issue that I felt strongly about. And it's not just the treatment of women, obviously. I mean, the Taliban, it was a hideous regime. If I had more time, I would go into how we enabled the Taliban before that, but we don't have enough time to go into all of that now. So there have been positive changes in Afghanistan as a result of our invasion. In Iraq, I mean, there was no way to defend Saddam Hussein and his regime, and Saddam Hussein was ousted. What I would say is this really what we want for our country, though? And is this really what we want for our servicemen and women? Do we want wars as in Iraq, which I think it wasn't necessary to fight, and in fact wrong to fight? And do we want wars like Afghanistan, where I supported the invasion, but now it's almost a decade later, and we're escalating now, and we have no idea how much longer it's going to go on? And my argument is that these endless wars are very debilitating in terms of our society here at home. And also, you know, I wish your son was not in harm's way, but the longer we continue these wars, the more children we put in harm's way. And the more children we send over there for 2 tours, 3 tours, 4 tours, 5 tours. My argument is that that is not sustainable and it is wrong, and that we should stop. It's not that no good at all has come of these wars. It's that we're really hurting ourselves with the way we've been conducting these wars.
Maybe we could do one more question if there is one, and before we adjourn for our reception. You're going to have to pick there, Brandon.
A poor young man. They're going to get you after this event.
I have very conflicting emotions about what you talked about this afternoon. I share virtually every sentiment that you've expressed here. 50 years ago, I came home from Afghanistan. This is 1960, the summer of 1960. My son was 9 months old with us. Having spent 2 years there teaching English at Kabul University, working with Columbia University on a contract funded by the International Cooperation Administration, which was the predecessor to USAID. Let me tell you a brief story about what happened in the spring of something that happened in the spring of 1960. The Prime Minister, when the King was away in Italy, the Prime Minister took it upon himself to have a banquet one night, and he ordered all of his aides and his ministers and so forth to come to that banquet, to bring their wives, and their wives should come without wearing what we call chador at the time, which is an all-enveloping garment that hides a woman in public places, often called burqa. He ordered them to come not wearing that garment, and then he issued a decree that from henceforth, starting with young women in the schools, grade by grade, they should be allowed to appear in public without having to wear this all-enveloping garment. And in other words, this was a huge and major social innovation. Well, this happened in Kabul, and in the weeks immediately after this decree, we would see young women on the streets. We had never seen the face of an Afghan woman in public prior to this. But all of a sudden, we would see young women on the streets wearing a long coat, buttoned up to their neck, and a kerchief, but their faces were in view. And little by little, you would see a woman opening the top button of the coat, and then another one loosening the scarf, and another one putting lipstick on, and another one putting rouge on. And pretty soon you began to see Afghan women coming out in public here. And then there was a story that reached us about conservative mullahs in the south of Afghanistan, particularly and specifically in the city of Kandahar, which is very much in the news today, telling us that young women had been mutilated in public, their noses had been cut off because they were following this decree. And although we had never heard the term Taliban at this point in time, we knew immediately, recognized immediately, that there was an ultra-conservative element in the south of the country, in the Kandahar area, which is precisely the place where the Taliban has its headquarters now. So here's a situation, and this
so
is
your conflict is. Tell me what your conflict is.
My conflict is this: this is an intolerable ultra-conservative group that has wreaked havoc with the Afghan people in many ways, and in some respects, it is a parallel, I would say, to the Saddam Hussein situation in Iraq. And we felt very, very good about taking him down. And one of the problems that the questions that you raised here is, who are we fighting? Are we fighting the Taliban, or are we fighting Al Qaeda? Well, we would prefer to answer the question, I think, by saying we are fighting Al Qaeda wherever it is, because they're the ones that wreak havoc in our country here. But there is also this other terrible element going on in this society here, whether we have anything to do with it or not.
Well, let me see if I can respond, because I did cover the Taliban and what they were doing to women before September 11th, as I said. There is no defense for the behavior. The question is, what should our response be? And I have a couple of thoughts about that. One is, I've also covered countries in Africa where women are raped, mutilated, murdered, the most hideous things one can imagine, by the tens of thousands. Awful stuff. The question becomes, is warfare, invasion by the United States, in a way that doesn't even declare that that is the point of the invasion, is that the way to go? If we determine, and we have a free society, if we determine that we want to go to war on issues like this, then that would be a decision the United States should make. But then I would argue that we need, as I believe about any kind of war, to share in the sacrifice of that war. So if we're going to fight in Afghanistan to protect women from the hideous treatment of the Taliban, then my argument is that we all need to participate in that fight. We need to support that fight. We need to pay for that fight, and we need to recognize what that fight is doing to us here at home in the United States. I don't think we answer any of those questions. I don't think we consider any of those questions, whether we're fighting against the Taliban for the reasons that you point out, or whether we're really there for Al Qaeda, or whether we were in Iraq for whatever reasons. And I think that as long as we continue to go to war when we don't know what we're fighting for and we don't share in those sacrifices, we will continue to undermine what I think is the stability of the United States, and I think that we're going to pay a fearful price for that in the long run. Anyway, thank you very, very much. Thank you.